Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is CB Robertson. This is episode 39, I think. Is that right?
Your guess is as good as mine. It's
Okay.
not my podcast.
Okay. I believe this is episode 39. I have my wife Sierra here to try to keep me sane in this subject because I've wanted to talk about polling for some time now, actually. Mm-hmm. This is one of those inherited subjects where, my first favorite, commentator and thinker, Christopher Hitchens, had a long-standing hatred of polling, which I inherited, and
along with many of his weird intonations and inflections. If you ever go back and reread In Defense of Hatred, you will notice the subtle Hitchens-like sentence structure.
Well, I mean, it explicitly began with a Hitchens quote. Yeah.
Chris can only read books and listen to people whose names are also Christopher, which luckily there are a lot of them.
Like Nietzsche. Christopher Nietzsche is a very famous philosopher. But in any case, Aristotle, all those Greeks with only one name, you know their first name. Is really...
They were all Christophers.
But anyways, I had shared, or I guess I would say concurred with his opinion, through my own thinking about, science and the problems with utilitarianism, which we've already talked about, and that kind of like quantitative thinking silliness. But, in getting ready to talk about polling in a different way, I discovered actually an essay that Christopher Hitchens had written back in 1992 called Voting in the Passive Voice for Harper's magazine. Anyone can go on Google and find a PDF version of it. It's available from Harper's archive for free. And it's very worthwhile doing. But we read it together. Mm-hmm. What did you think of that?
It was like reading my husband in a past life, but also, someone had said about your writing that when you write of your own time, you write for all time. And I think that that's probably a sentiment that was applied to other people, but I first encountered that phrase as it applied to you. But anyway, a lot of that essay references things that were going on in the current era, but now with the hindsight of 30 years development from the 90s, like he repeatedly references and like people have cell phones and things on, the mainline.
Well, it was
TV.
the setting of his essay. While he was writing this essay, he was on the ground observing the Bill Clinton primary campaign mm-hmm. in New Hampshire.
Yeah.
Which is like a very specific time and place in the 90s.
But, obviously we all know how the rest of the 90s played out. And the hindsight of 30 more years of development from the time he wrote his essay initially, the problem he was describing and the pervasiveness and the we'll get into this as we actually dig into the topic of polling and what's wrong with it. But, all of the things he identifies have just metastasized to a level that's unreal. That I'm like, God, this is so prescient.
Yeah, it feels like you're reading that was like the 1890s quote condemning, the Conservative Party is not conserving anything. Mm-hmm. The American Conservative Party will, acquiesce to, donkeys voting and stand on its high horse and say, well, at least we didn't permit cats to vote. Or I'm butchering that quote horrendously, but
and the Conservative Party has continued to stand very still in the face of the moving river ever since.
Right, and it is a worthwhile essay, but I think if I were to summarize what that essay was about, Hitchens is a, tremendous believer in democracy. He's very much a liberal in the classical sense as well as in the colloquial kind of left-wing sense. He was a leftist, self-described hard leftist. But he seriously believed in democracy and in the American Republic and that whole participatory model. And to him, his big complaint about polling was that it was essentially preempting opinion, collecting opinion, and laundering it in a very sophisticated manner. Well, sophisticated is almost the right word because the mechanism is sophisticated. The actual polling itself was precisely remarkable for its lack of sophistication. Like, one of his complaints was that the actually nuanced and well thought through opinions of the polled citizens almost never fit neatly or were captured or described by the, categories or even the continuums offered by these polls. It was like, do you strongly agree? Do you somewhat agree? Do you somewhat disagree? Do you strongly disagree? There's no room for reasoning that would give context to why you might strongly support something or support something in a more contextualized manner.
Yeah, I think his complaint about polling, and this is certainly the one that I think you and I both definitely share, is there's something about it that's a little bit like surgery. You say to yourself, and when any of us, a lay person, is thinking about medicine and surgery, we're like, oh, it's very sophisticated. This is like very modern, only the most sophisticated of tools, blah, blah, blah. And then you get in there and it's butchery, right? I mean, you're chopping stuff up like they're using a blunt axe. You know what I mean? Like, we're cutting this leg off to save your life. Like, it ain't going to be pretty.
Don't look up the origin story of the chainsaw if you want to save yourself some nightmares.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, and that's exactly what polling is. It's like a blunt axe applied behind the scenes, so but then covered over with this very nice veneer of very respectable, very serious, very systematic,
very objective and scientific, because it's all quantitative.
Yeah. And so I think, like you said, the summary of his essay is to say that, like, they take very nuanced positions that you might come to for very different reasons and feel strongly about in one way or the other to various degrees, and summarize it down to a 4-point option. And the last one is not sure, don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And the conclusion of that essay is a somewhat terrifying conclusion, is that polling is, in Hitchens' opinion, in some respect replacing or subverting democracy, actually replacing the vote almost entirely, at least in a meaningful way. And it's doing that through the primary processes and the electoral processes that precede the official vote, so that the candidates that you are offered have been pre-selected by this polling process, and that the very nature of that quantitative process essentially cuts out all intelligent question asking and really intelligent thinking. It's all down to this blunt axe, data oriented approach to what's popular versus what isn't.
Well, and then it also guides what's popular and what isn't by sort of salting the jar ahead of time and framing things in such a way that you sort of are forced to state your intention to have an opinion, even if you may not have in any way formed an opinion. And then, so twofold. Firstly,
he talks about forced choice a couple of times.
Right. Yeah. So first, there's the problem as the person taking the poll of being forced into a position of having to assign yourself a place in your opinion. And then secondly, there's this secondary impact of all of the rest of us hearing what the results of the poll is, which gives the rest of us this very weird piece of information, which is the general consensus.
Yes, consensus was a word he focused on a fair bit. And I think that point, consensus, sort of gets to the heart of the matter because, before I had even read this essay, I was thinking about, this subject, and I was like, well, there are basically two reasons to dismiss polls out of hand. The first reason is that the way they ask questions is often very what they call question begging. They're trying to get the right answer that will benefit their clients. It's very biased in the way that they frame the questions, and some of these are very obvious, especially in the language of like pro-life versus pro-choice, for example, both loaded terms. But the second reason. And through you can basically make a poll say whatever you want it to say, and then voila, you have objective metrics on your side. But second of all, as we sort of said before, the nature of polling itself, even if you are doing this with the best of intentions and the highest standards of question design, and like what we see in air quote scientific surveys, for example. People take great pains to try to design these surveys to be as objective and accurate as possible.
And also not leading and all that kind of stuff.
Well-designed questions that will elucidate answers that are meaningful to falsifiable hypotheses. Even in that case, the nature of polling itself still falls into, creates blind spots in so far as people are able to, accurately describe their own behavior. But second of all, it has that simplifying effect we were talking about before, where the reasoning is often not givable, even in principle. And a lot of qualitative substance is lost when you plot what are often contingencies, like, well, I would support X candidate unless Y happens, and then I'd support Z candidate, because of alpha reason. That isn't just a continuum of I'd give this guy a 7 and this guy a 3 on my preferability score, and that simplification loses a lot of meaningful substance that changes what is predictive. A lot of these polls are, in fact, not predictive.
So to make sure we address what's so wrong with polls, though, it's not just the polling mechanism is one whole piece of it, right? But the other piece is also the ubiquitousness of hearing about them.
Well, can I finish my point first?
Oh, sorry.
Because so those are the two reasons to dismiss polls. I'm sorry that took longer to say than I had intended. But the final point, and this is a point that I think I first heard Hitchens bring up like a decade ago when he was talking about it, and I was listening, was why should anyone care what 78% of Americans think about that? Right. Like, without that reasoning, first of all, a lot of them probably agree with each other for different and mutually exclusive reasons. Like people might have supported Bush because he thought he would keep America out of war. Like that's a position people can hold. But they like the number of people who support or are purported to support a particular view has no bearing whatsoever on whether that view is good or not, or good for you or not. So then the question becomes, what is the purpose of reporting these polls? If it is not to convey, how would you explain in the abstract, in principle, what the value is to the citizen of understanding what other citizens think around them. How would you explain the value there?
Well, that's exactly the part that I truly can't come up with the answer. We've been discussing this at the dinner table for many, many dinners at this point. I don't know. I can see if I was trying to be an advocate for polls, I could be like, okay, well, the reason we need this information is because, people like politicians or people like scientists need to know what people's opinions are on things, or like what experiences people have had or whatever. Like surveys matter for data collection. And you'd be like, okay, that makes sense. I understand. Like trying to research, the human experience stuff or politics or whatever. I get it. We need to like occasionally ask people to, put themselves on a Likert scale. Got it. But then from there.
But that's to the politician. That's not why is this poll from Rasmussen or Pew ending up in the New York Times?
Well, no, so that's where I'm going. This is me trying to, be a devil's advocate and why do we care about polls? It's like, okay, politicians need to know what the actual cultural opinion is, what the default opinion is, or what his constituents' opinion is on something. Okay, that makes sense. So, his advisors want to know, the politician wants to know. Got it. But then from there, it's like, what the handoff that I can't really fathom why it does matter, except for sneaky reasons, is why from the, an individual politician knowing these results and knowing these opinions, why that then leaks to news reporters who then have to tell us people. Like the chain of command after it leaves the hands of the politician and his advisor doesn't exactly make sense to me at all.
Yeah, well, it is questionable how valuable these polls are to the politicians themselves too. I mean, they're sold as quite valuable.
They're apparently quite expensive.
They're very expensive to conduct, but like sold by whom, right?
Right.
Like, does the politician's knowledge of statistics and polling is that sufficient to know that what they're buying is actually meaningful?
Right.
Who knows? Only the pollsters know, and maybe they don't even know. But I could see a very vague, abstract argument, a kind of knowledge is power. It's good to know what your fellow citizens are thinking in a general kind of way, so that you have a lay of the land. But how would that, like, we all know the value of knowing what the weather is going to be, right? Like that's a very direct knowledge. What's the actual actionable utility of knowing what your neighbors think?
Okay, this is going to be a stretch, but I just thought of a possible one. When we made the choice to move from one side of the state to the other, we did so in no small part because we knew that the general prevailing opinion in this area was closer to ours, and that was a pro for us. Now,
but we didn't learn that by studying polls. We did that by literally driving through, and you can literally see it and sense it. Polling, as presented at the national level, doesn't give you geographic breakdowns like that.
Hang on. I said this was a stretch. Okay. We did look up things. We knew things about like who. Now, to be fair, we weren't looking at polls, but we did look at actual markers, like, not actual in obviously the poll numbers exist. I mean, in a like practical sense, like we know who the politicians are. We know who actually got voted in, what kinds of policies exist here, crime statistics, things like that. We did look at those sorts of things.
But none of those are polls.
I know. I'm trying to say though, like I'm making it was a possibility. It's a possible argument to move from one place to another, as if that 60% of 90% of people agree with this kind of thing in this area. You might like that, and you might want to go live there too.
Yeah.
Obviously, on a national level,
but those kinds of stats are not only not plastered in on the front pages of New York Times, Huffington Post, even Fox News and MSNBC and all these other news sources. Opinion poll from Rasmussen says X. That kind of data is often buried. unless it's in like especially on crime data.
I mean, okay, so I mean, crime data is a slightly different category, but
The only exception I know is there are certain kinds of education data that gets pushed, but also data pertaining to human fecal matter in San Francisco. That works its way into the news. I can't think of any other like serious data stories.
I will say, specifically as it pertains to like political elections, which I guess is what all polling. I shouldn't provide that caveat because that's obviously what we're talking about. We're talking about polling, but anyway,
people's opinions,
right? People's opinions on politics, though, on matters that might be impacted by politics. I will say, seeing elections and things, and seeing some of these polls and whatever that are going on in other parts of the country has given me a very broad brush, either generally positive or generally negative attitude toward other people in other states that I have never met. Like a aggregate average, like, oh, you know, Ohio is one of those currently or lately has been a swing state. And so like I have frankly more respect for people from Ohio because clearly they're like could be swayed or whatever. They are not necessarily, you know, they don't all go one way or the other, but like the general opinion of California is like they're always going to go blue. So like I kind of know what they're going to be like before I even meet them.
It's funny though because there's a term I forget. There's a prefix to a certain kind of amnesia where you read a news headline that's in a subject domain that you happen to be an expert in, and you can immediately say, oh, all of this is nonsense. Everything in the story is nonsense. And then you flip the newspaper to the next page and you say, oh, there's a war going on in Lebanon. And these are the sides and these are the things that are happening. Oh, so interesting. How interesting. And you assume that everything that's reported in the areas outside of your domain are correct. Now, we live in Washington State, which is not quite among the bluest of the blues. I think California...
We're trying our best.
We are trying our best. Yeah, California, New Jersey, New York. There are a few other places beat us, but not many. Washington is pretty bad. But the general character of Washington is not blue. There's basically like 3 blue counties.
And then the rest of us.
Yeah, there are 3 blue, and like King County basically dominates the entire state.
Yeah.
And it's not even like all of King County is blue either. It's just the Seattle area and you know, Tacoma probably as well. And there's like 3 major blue counties. And then the rest of the state is just, and Oregon is in a very similar situation. And you would, by looking at the effects, in Washington, you would misjudge the general character of the people in the state if you were to just look at who happens to be in political power, because who happens to be in political power does not, in fact, represent the people there necessarily very well. And I mean, that would be my view with Ohio, and probably the broader problem with polling.
Well, but see, so I have, you know, obviously we have our own political opinions between the two of us, but the default reason I like people from swing states is because my assumption is that they are generally, obviously, the kinds of people who are not stuck in their, like our state, I just sort of assume that we're always gonna, I mean, I just know that like to a certain degree, especially when we were living in King County, it's like our vote didn't matter. It was getting canceled out by the overwhelming majority of college students and other Seattleites. So it kind of didn't matter what we thought. We have a little more say, especially in a regional capacity where we live now, but being in a state where you know that your vote will, like, we're going to take probably decades to be able to ever turn Washington to be a red state. But the idea that like Ohio could flip every like 2 years, that to me gives me a lot more respect for the people who live there, to the degree that they're not dominated by one region the way that we are. Because like California, I know statistically that's true also in California, that like Southern California is super blue. Northern California is not, right? But the rest of the state gets dominated by those high populous big city areas. Swing states that flip seem like they would be maybe, better. I don't know.
Well, I mean, whether a state is flippable or not is I don't think. Here, I feel like we're getting off of polling a little bit. Maybe it's related. I don't know. But like, to me, looking at a state like California, or the entire nation of Canada is another example. It feels less like a measure of the people and more like of a measure of the absence of corruption in the not the electoral process, but the bureaucracy surrounding the electoral process, the gatekeeping to the institutions themselves. Because I don't think Justin Trudeau, for example, has the majority of support in Canada, but he's also not going anywhere. I think one could say the same thing about Biden, who is somehow both the most popular and least popular president in living memory by a lot. And there are like benign explanations for that. Like, he was anti-voted in by people who really, really, really disliked Trump, and that's possible. But in places at the local state level, like Chicago in Illinois, the corruption is not just so deep, but also so well known. You are never going to get a Republican, governor, no matter how many local Chicagoans actually happen to have conservative beliefs. It has nothing to do with...
Well, I don't know that it has nothing to do with it. I think this maybe can zoom us back into the polling specifically, because the trouble with some place like Chicago is that, just like I was saying about the state of Washington, and especially when we were in King County, my very deep feeling was my vote didn't matter. And so you may, whether... And the reason I thought that was because I very deeply believed, and I was reinforced in a lot of both polling and like personal experience kinds of ways, to believe that no one shared my opinion. You and I finding each other was quite the anomaly. Like, it's hard to find another conservative in King County. But to the degree that polling is influencing our perception of what everybody else believes, there may be a lot of gaslit Chicagoans who think that there are no other conservatives there either, who, don't think their vote matters. And so they've gotten basically demoralized out of bothering to participate in the system, such that that they have made themselves irrelevant because of the polls, believe there's no hope anyway.
Oh, for sure. And it can become a kind of self-reinforcing thing. But...
Well, no, hang on. Don't blow past that point. That's exactly what we're talking about with polling, is that the existence of these polls can position can frame the general mood in such a way that you can end up with people becoming basically demoralized in their own environment, or demoralized related to their own political process, whether it's at the state level or national. And really, they could, if they just did, ironically, if they didn't know the result of the poll, they might just vote, and then the whole thing would be a completely different landscape.
Oh, because right. This brings us back to the question of, why are we being presented with this? Why are we being presented with this so incessantly and repetitively in so many places? And it's hard to think of any other... I guess this has been a very long digression, trying to thought experiment our way into some other position. But is there another reason to present all this other than to prime people's beliefs and to prime people into thinking in terms of inevitable candidates? And like, oh, this person is, one of the words Hitchens focused on was electable. Like, what the hell does that mean? What is electable supposed to mean? What does that refer to? What qualities would that entail?
I'd argue the most electable quality is, can I spell their last name on the ballot? But
seriously though, Scott Adams has been making fun of one of our chief negotiators abroad as a guy named Blinken. And he's like, you don't pick a negotiator named Blinken.
Not unless you bring his friends Winkin and Nod.
I guess. But you imagine a stare down contest. You don't want your guy to be the guy named Blinken. And I as opposed to someone like Trump, just the name has a kind of, electability, I suppose. Never mind his, his policy positions or whatever.
I think the issue of corruption related to elections is interesting because I feel like I don't want to overuse the word psyop. It's been in my mind lately, so I've been using it a lot to refer to things that probably aren't actually psyops. But I kind of feel like polling is a psyop, and the biggest one that they do is how many polls have been about things like election corruption that, again, just put the Overton window where they want it to create basically, and I was saying they in like scare quotesy ways, they are guiding what we even think is possible and framing all of it to make it seem very much like kind of a foregone conclusion. I think that's the tricky thing with polls. And to me, the thing that is the worst and most insidious about polls is the way that it does frame our Overton window and our context for what we even believe is possible or worthwhile or worth doing, because we kind of already know what we think everybody else is going to think about it. And I think the reason it works, from the Hitchens article, he said that like the first, I think it was Gallup poll came out in like 1942 or something, and they tried to use the name pollster to associate it with the word huckster to make you feel negative about these people who insist on asking everyone's opinion and then telling you what everybody else's opinion is. But somehow, like, the pollsters, like, took it and were like, cool, that's the name we'll use. And then they just, like, absolutely shed any negative connotations and have, obviously, Gallup continues to be one of the main polls that we all know about to this day. So when he's complaining about in the 90s, this has already been going on for 50 years. And now we're 30 years further along. And we're to the point where not only do journalists only have to report the latest poll without actually asking anyone's opinion, but you can just supplement it with Twitter tweets and call that, a full article and describe for everybody else what everybody else's opinion is. Obviously, look, here it is. I've got it in hard numbers. And I think the reason it's working incrementally more over time is because of our friend Ted Kaczynski's favorite word that I honestly think is underutilized and should be used all the time: over-socialization. The reason it's working and working more and more over time, and we cannot, I don't know of a way that we can get out of escape of polls. How are we going to escape the trap of being told what everybody else's opinion is? I don't know. But I do think the reason it's working is because we're over-socialized. I have an idea. I think the general population has become over-socialized. Everyone's gone to the same government schools, has been getting more of the same programming. Public access television, all these sorts of things. We're very much being led to believe that we need to know what everybody else's opinion is. So then when we find out what it is, we take it as a given, like that's meaningful information. And then we are influenced by it, and we do, to some degree, change our opinion. Sometimes our opinion is, obviously, there's nothing, my opinion doesn't matter, so I'm just going to check out, which is the opinion I had in King County. And other times it might be like, oh, there's hope. And so, we're like, see, look, the 2A population is so big in this country, whatever. Those are all opinions that are led by us having been told what other people's opinions are.
And sometimes it can be very indirect and strange. One of the creepier and more insidious stories Hitchens told was of an electoral campaign where the incumbent was down,
unelectable.
Yeah,
very unlikable.
They were behind some young upstart with good ideas. And so after doing a bunch of polling, and this is perhaps a case in which polling maybe does have some predictive qualities, and my criticism isn't absolute, but they determined that the only way to get the incumbent to win would be to demoralize everybody so much that the majority of people wouldn't even want to participate. And so they ran a super negative campaign that was all about targeting the other side, which then the other side had to like kind of fight back. And it became this just crap throwing contest that resulted in most of the voters just not bothering and walking out, which was exactly what was intended to happen, and the incumbent won.
Yeah, because when you get most people who would have been excited to not show up, they vote for whoever's already on the ballot and move on with their lives. And that's exactly, they had like super low voter turnout and like snuck by, just like barely managed to beat the other guy. Yeah. And yeah, the pollster himself was very demoralized when he realized, what have I done?
Pretty much. And then he quit. And it feels like when you look at how polls are conducted and who they're conducted for and how they're employed, you're watching Walter Lippmann's idea of manufactured consent in real time. And if you are a believer in democracy like Hitchens, where the consent of the governed is like a meaningful and real thing, and you're seeing that manufactured in this very fake way where votes are like are dials and knobs on a sound mixer board that you're tuning a little bit here. The vote that results from these polls loses a lot of its meaning. Like, in what sense is a vote that was massaged and manipulated and guided by these polls in this manufactured fashion, in this psychologically engineered fashion, in what way is that representative of the will of the people anymore?
If this was in any other context, I think we would see how obviously wretched polling is. Because, I mean, there's a reason why in jury selection they work so hard to make sure that you don't know all the details. This is why, news reporters are forbidden to share certain pieces of information from an investigation, because knowing if the populace knows too much about what is thought to have happened, the jury is now tainted and can't give a fair verdict. And so if you think of polls like that, you'd be like, oh,
tainted elections,
right? We're all tainted juries.
Yeah. Not fraudulent elections, just tainted elections. And it's, it's very easy to get kind of blackpilled on this and think, oh, what would you even do about this? But I think the more I thought about this in advance, the more it started to bring up a phrase that I first heard from Curtis Yarvin, but which I actually didn't know where it came from originally. The phrase is political formula. And a political formula is basically a story that justifies and legitimizes power and authority in society. So like the normal example is the divine right of kings is a political formula that justifies the power and authority of the king. Well, God put me here in place. And if enough people believe that, the king's power and authority is legitimized. In the United States, the political formula is something like democracy and science, or what like Jonathan Rauch would call liberal science. I've talked a little bit about him before on the podcast. And polling feels like it's hacking the liberal science political formula as a way to get inside of that way of thinking and preempt people with that story. And so like there's an idea a lot of especially reactionary types have, which is like, in order to get out of this fake democracy and this kind of growing anarcho-tyranny that we have, we need to reject the whole story. We need to do something like fascist or like, like monarchy, yeah, or Hans Hermann Hoppe feudalism, or something weird. But if you actually understand the foundational story well enough and put this polling phenomena that sort of masquerades as a manifestation of that nice numerical, objective, even scientific expression of democratic opinion, and all of the problems with that, there's actually a way to work within the story, which is a lot stronger, just so much stronger, and undermining that manipulation, I think.
How would one work within the story, Chris?
Well, like you would just point out the absolutely pseudoscientific nature of polling to start with. Like, this is absolutely nonsense in a scientific manner. These are, not really meaningful, except insofar as they are useful for, as we discussed before, priming the public's opinion or demoralizing them. And
okay, so are you just saying that, like, every time I watch the news, I should be like, this poll doesn't mean anything? I can feel that you believe you have an idea for how we could actually resist the influence of polls, but I'm not gonna lie to you, I'm not grasping it.
Oh, well, yeah, they're ridiculous. And
no, I know, but what do you do about it?
Well, you call them ridiculous.
To who?
To everybody.
My mom? Like...
Well, so yeah, I mean, there are a couple ways of doing this. Hitchens used to go on about how, joking about how the certain headers that newspapers would print. The New York Times would say, like, all the news that's fit to print, or some other tautological silliness. And like some other newspaper had the astrology sign still, and he thought that was always silly. But my favorite one pertaining to polls is Scott Adams has been doing this for, I think, a year now, maybe over a year. He's come up with we could call it the Adams law of polls, which is, and anyone who's not familiar with Scott Adams' stream might drop in and he'll be like, well, Rasmussen poll today said, guess what the percentage of Americans think, and before he'll even finish the sentence, before he'll even say what the poll is about, what they asked, all of his commenters will say 25%, 23%, 26%. They'll all say 25%. And the Adams law is that no matter what the question is, no matter how obvious the correct answer is, no matter what the subject is, on any polling question, 25% of the people will give the absolutely wrong answer. No, it doesn't matter. He'll say, what percentage of Americans have faith that Congress is doing a good job? 25% will say yes. 25% will say yes. What percentage of Americans think the Federal Reserve has been doing a good job? About 25%. Doesn't matter what the subject is. 25% will. But how you break down what people believe is a very subjective thing. And if you actually listen to how Scott Adams does the breakdowns, it's believable, but it's a little bit subjective, but it works.
I think what you mean to say is not that it's subjective how you break it down. I think what you mean to say is giving people in your own circle a different frame. I mean, obviously Scott Adams has a pretty big circle, but the more that all of us go, oh yeah, every poll works out to being about 25% of people have whatever stupid opinion. Then the next person, now it's like an earworm. Like, you gave them a bad song and now they can't stop singing it. And they're like, I see it everywhere now. So to that degree, like, breaking the glass for people, where you're giving them something like that they could be like, oh, look how predictable the quote unquote predictive polls are. And then they're like, huh. And they kind of can't unsee it. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and the way he gets 25 is sometimes by saying, like, oh, here's a poll of people who think X thing Kanye said was bad. And it'll be like, 12% said, yeah, that was bad. And like 11% said they weren't sure. So,
It's still worse at 25.
like the thing that is the obviously wrong answer in Scott Adams' opinion, I'm making stuff up. Kanye, I'm sure he said something stupid recently, but like the you can make it kind of massage it into 25 to fit the meme, and Scott is masterful at doing that kind of massaging. But the pollsters are pretty good at that too. But when Scott Adams does it, it's funny because it fits into this meme. And then you can see it in action. And again, it makes the polls themselves a funny story and kind of silly and ridiculous. But they are ridiculous. They're like, they're ridiculous epistemologically for the two reasons we listed before, like the leading nature of the questions and the simplifying nature of the medium itself. It literally cannot accommodate the kind of deeper, in-depth thinking that we would see in a democracy that was characterized for example, pamphleteering. Like the Federalist and Anti-Federalist paper pamphleteering wars. Like that is real democratic dialogue. Competing polls is not. Competing polls is just like data laundering. And we could probably talk about data laundering in a way that goes beyond just polling. Maybe we'll have to save meta-analyses for another day, because that's probably its own big subject. And I don't want to bite off more than we can chew, but like the way that polling seems to hack the political formula, which I forgot to mention, that comes from an Italian political philosopher named Gaetano Mosca, which I learned about from Curtis Yarvin by way of a book called The Machiavellians by James Burnham. Highly recommended. But interesting bit of trivia that I think is useful in understanding why polling is so effective.
Insidious. Well, and insidious to the degree that it's taking the formula that exists and then working within it. So, and working within it to its own ends that may not be the ones that you want. And I think the Machiavellians goes on to talk about the difference between a political formula and like ideologies. Or is that, no, that's something else? Oh, okay.
That was me differentiating. I was explaining the difference between Mosca's view and Marx's view, because Karl Marx believed an ideology. Marx defined an ideology as any idea that justified power. And it's inherently unjust, because inequality in power is inherently bad in Marx's view and inherently unjustified. Whereas with Mosca takes a different foundational axiom. Mosca believed that in every society there will be a ruling elite, and there will be a different story that explains why this happens. But in Mosca's view, the story often precedes power, whereas in Marx's view, the story is always like retroactive. We have an ex post facto rationalization for why I get to be in charge and you don't. Whereas in Mosca's view, that could be the case, but it could also be the case that here's a story as to who gets power. Oh, it's whoever can draw a sword out of a stone gets to be in power. Well, there's a sword and there's a stone. Oh, Larry was able to pull it out, so I guess Larry's king. Well, the story preceded Larry's kingship. Mm-hmm. So it's a little different than Marx's view of ideology.
So, but what I think is happening with polls is this phenomena of somebody wanting to get the formula still exists, that we use democratic votes to elect candidates who then, cast their ballot in the Electoral College on our behalf. That formula still exists even with polling. The problem is that polling has taken the whole dialogue and turned it into something that can be influenced before the voter has even cast their vote.
Right. It's hacked it and corrupted it, and it's taking these premises and how do I put it?
I think I diverted you. I thought I was leading you into something that I didn't mean to, and it's similar to not wanting to bite off the data conversation about meta-analyses in this particular episode. I don't want to throw in ideologies at the end here too, but I think to kind of sum it up, if there is anything that can be done about polling, because I don't know that there's a way any one of us can break the glass or change the frame for enough people in our community to convince people to stop caring about polls. And certainly no one's gonna I think it will be a cold day in hell when we manage to wrench polling results out of the hands of every news reporter. But to the degree that you yourself can choose to, just take polls, not even with a grain of salt, but just to move on beyond them, to just skim over that part of the paragraph and continue reading to something of actual substance. You yourself and anyone you can convince will be freer than those who, just watch headlines and get poll results and tweet opinions as their news. But I don't know that there's anything else we can do about it.
Well, you can do what I do.
Okay.
And what I like to do, and I'm not encouraging this, I in fact strongly discourage this. You should not do what I do, but I like to mess with polls. I like to take them whenever I can, and answer in a way that is maximally amusing to me. And I like to remember as I do it that lots of other people do the same thing. But even the people who take the poll seriously, if you answer these questions and think to yourself as you're answering them very seriously, taking these polls very seriously, because this is our democracy at stake, how well do these results capture my real opinions? And if you get to the end and you think of this Pew poll, this Rasmussen poll, yes, I feel well represented by this. I've taken a political compass test. I've ended up exactly in the middle and thought, yes, that exactly represents how I think in politics. I think you might be thinking as shallowly as a poll. My amusing, goofy answers when they call my number and ask my opinion about Washington's electoral state of affairs and particular candidates is actually no less meaningful than the people who take it deadly seriously. And to me, going through that is kind of therapeutic. It's very, it reminds me of just how nonsensical it is. And I hope other people out there know just how many people don't take these polls seriously, or just who do take it seriously by saying no and refusing, which is another category of people that are, by definition, not reflected in the polls because they didn't do them. And if there's a personality type to that, well, that's meaningful. But whatever they are, however predictive they are portrayed to be, is very often part of the magic. And a what do they call it? A self-fulfilling prophecy. Mm-hmm. That we don't have to take seriously any more than we take the latest economist's prediction of a recession seriously.
Well, and to your point that you'd be in a more, prior to polls, there was pamphleteering wars. To the degree that you have the capacity to just learn the issues and then actually try to either debate or encourage and help to spread actual communication about actual topics, there has to be something to fill the void in the newsprint and sharing actual information, that has to be there for one day when the toppling tower of polling finally does come down by some means. I don't know. Perhaps my husband's trans Asian middle-aged environmentalist gun-toting Christian apologist can that you represent in so many polls.
In some polls,
will one day topple the whole system, but until that day, we need to also make sure that we're backfilling with actual information. So to the degree you have the capacity to share actual information, not just poll results of opinions about other people's opinions on issues, I think that's the thing that will have to already be present for that one magical day when the polls do eventually get pulled from headlines.
Yeah, and not taking, to borrow another phrase, not taking security or not taking refuge in the false security of consensus, and the idea that you're bound to be okay if you're in the safely moral majority, because the safely moral majority A might have been entirely manufactured, and B also doesn't know what they're doing, probably doesn't agree with each other, despite having been made to appear to agree with each other, and is still likely wrong anyways. So it's it is something to keep an eye on for, but I think it will eventually collapse in the way that the old Nordic tulip bulb bubble collapsed. People will eventually realize the insubstantial nature of them. It will be replaced by something else.
Hopefully pamphleteering or something meaningful.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there will be more corruptions and corrupt manifestations of the political formula that undergirds the power of a society. There probably always will be. But if we can understand these kinds of corruptions in relation to the valid and true thing, and understand that pattern, maybe we'll have a better eye to spot not just problems with polling, but things like polling as well in the next iteration.
Well said.
Cool. Well, I think we'll call it that. We've been going for a little while, so thanks so much for listening. Take care.